and welcome to Hostile Takeover, Tech Capital and the Coup of the U.S. Government. I'm Thomas Murray Dawson with the Center for Political Education, joining you from occupied land in the so-called East Bay of California. If you're like me, you found it hard to keep up with everything this new administration is trying to smash and grab over its first month in power. That's precisely the strategy of the second MAGA coalition: overwhelm and demoralize its opponents by flooding the zone with exponential crises. Notwithstanding the reality that there are indeed really serious and troubling consequences for a wide swath of people we all really care about, and in many aspects of our public life, more and more people are coming to an understanding that a primary aspect of what's taking place involves something we're all familiar with: the wealthiest people trying to do all they can to accumulate more for themselves and at the expense of everyone else. On Thursday, February 27th, we launched the first installment in a political education series that we hope will provide you with some greater clarity on this primary aspect of what we're dealing with: capitalists, led by an insurgent tech elite, and their hostile takeover of our public resources and the levers of power within our executive branch and administrative government. For part one, the privatization of government, we were grateful to have with us a panel of researchers and longtime labor organizers who've been closely focused on how tech capital and private equity operate, including the familiar tactics of takeover that are being employed to eviscerate social welfare and the public sector from within the federal administrative state. They helped us understand the players and playbook at work, recognize the familiar strategies of privatization and financialization, and left us with key areas of resistance by federal workers and some resources for you to continue your study and understanding of what's going on. A little bit more about our speakers. First, we were joined by Vasudha, a researcher studying the relationship between venture capital, crypto, and working communities in California. Prior to her work in this arena, she spent over a decade at SEIU, ASME, and LIUNA, fighting against corporate and financial exploitation of workers. She actually helped retail workers draft and introduce the first federal bill to rein in private equity firms. And next we had Chastity Murphy. Chastity is a fellow and visiting scholar at the University of Manchester, researching technology's impact on marginalized communities. Until very recently, she was working at the U.S. Treasury, overseeing its work on AI, cryptocurrency, digital assets, consumer protections, and financial inclusion. She previously advised Representative Rashida Tlaib on eCash, stablecoins, and financial reform, and will help provide us with unique insight into what's happening with one of the key points of capture for this administrative coup: the U.S. Treasury and its payment system. And finally, we had Alyssa Giacchino, who has worked on economic justice for around 20 years. She focuses on corporate accountability and sustainable investment practices, with a particular investment on private equity. Like Vasudha, she spent many years in union work before her current research, including 15 years with SEIU, Unite Here, and UAW, all working to improve conditions for low-wage workers in sectors such as hospitality, building services, and manufacturing. For this conversation, Vasudha starts us off by grounding us in the key players involved and in their playbook, and then it opens up to a conversation with Vasudha, Chastity, and Alyssa to get a deeper sense of what's really going on in DC right now. We hope you find this conversation a resource for your organizing and activism in this moment.
So, I'm so sorry for making you all look at this like big crowd of losers, like every face card is declined. But I wanted to do a sort of cursory review of who all these guys are, because these are the MAGA guys that are behind this hostile takeover of the government. And to be clear, these are only the unelected ones, and the most powerful ones. The elected ones we'll get into, or the Senate confirmed ones we'll get into in a second later. I have spent about a decade studying some combination of these dudes, and I have to tell you, they are just not as smart as they make themselves out to be, which is good to know. It's good to know their ideology, because it'll help all of you who are organizers and activists make sense of this moment and support your organizing. So first up, this dude with the glasses, this is Curtis Yarvin. I think he's the name that many of you have been hearing over and over again. A new right intellectual who believes that democracy is dead, so we actually need a CEO monarch. I mean, just again, completely batshit insane stuff, right? He's a former tech guy, says the worst things about slavery, apartheid, Gaza, you name it. He also hates Elon Musk, and he's very influential intellectually with people like Peter Thiel, who is over here, JD Vance, and others. Second up, we have Steve Bannon, again, probably someone you're all familiar with, a MAGA architect who's also a leader, as I mentioned, in the global far right. And economic nationalism is his thing. It is his bread and butter. He was influenced a lot by Curtis Yarvin, but really Andrew Breitbart was his mentor and his biggest influence. So a lot of the anti-government views come from him being taken under the wing of someone like Breitbart. This guy, I think, sorry. This guy, I think you all know, ugly white South African man, doesn't really have an ideology beyond trolling and usurping power, which is very interesting because most of the rest of them do. They have studied things, they have read extreme far right literature, they've read a lot and referenced a lot of leftist literature. You don't get any of that from Elon Musk. This is just someone who is like a byproduct of Silicon Valley, corporate America, and quite frankly got red pilled on his own website, and we are seeing the ramifications of that now. Another white South African man, Peter Thiel, super rich, Christian nationalist, made his money in tech venture capital, and he's the money guy behind the new right. So people like Curtis Yarvin, things like NatCon, which are these like right-wing cultural conferences and things like that, Thiel is behind them and behind a lot of these like disrupting startups. He's also a pseudo-intellectual. He started as a libertarian, but actually has moved to the extreme far right since then. And if you are a leftist who loves David Graeber, there is like a 13-year-old YouTube debate between Peter Thiel and David Graeber that is like super worth looking into. This egg-shaped man is Mark Andreessen, also a venture capital guy. He was like a Dem-ish kind of guy flirting with libertarianism and then flipped a few years ago, got more red pilled, and posts the most insane manifestos quoting Nietzsche. He is also the co-founder and principal of the largest venture capital firm. So this man behaving like a freshman taking a philosophy 101 class and trying to be an edgelord is a really, really bad look. And lastly, you have David Sachs. Again, another white South African man, another venture capitalist, and he is now Trump's crypto and AI czar. He's been super active in Bay Area and California conservative politics, organized big fundraisers for Trump, and generally follows the sort of like JD Vance line of ideology and thinking. So not all of them are on the same parts of the political spectrum, but they're all deeply down on liberal democracy. They really hate liberal democracy. They hate big government. They all do have different versions of like visions of how that should manifest politically. So what are the things that they actually agree on and want? And I wanted to, this is a simplified version that you're getting, but I wanted to name them in ways that we all understand because there are some ways in which this moment is exceptional, and there's other ways that it's really not. And the elite's desire to control the state and make more money is pretty standard and something we can all understand. They do want to privatize big chunks of the government, and privatization is a little bit, it's got a few different definitions here. At least I'm using it for simplification's sake. So the MAGA grass tops that I talked about, they're big fans of market-based solutions over government control, and they want to outright privatize government, or they want to outright privatize government programs like Social Security. Then you have guys like Curtis Yarvin and the New Right who believe that government-run programs are shoddy and should just be under corporate control, but under this framework of having a CEO monarch and government essentially being a startup state. And with all of these things, we're going to hear more from our speakers, Chaz and Alyssa, tonight about how this is playing out right now. On regulation, oh my God, these guys hate regulation. And they try to couch it in this like stupid intellectual discourse that is so painful to read. But at the end of the day, they want to move fast and break things without any accountability or oversight. That's literally it. And of course, they hate the government, but not when they are in charge of it, right? As we all know, capitalism needs to grow to survive. So why not usurp the federal government and turn it into a revenue source that benefits all of their corporate entities? And then lastly, or second to last, lower taxes and profit maximization. They are always looking for this. They are able to get it. Obviously, if they are in political power, they are able to achieve it more easily than you would be able to if you had to lobby a senator and pass legislation or lobby an agency, blah, blah, blah. They're able to do it in the fastest way possible. And lastly, private sector innovation. They want this so bad because they fundamentally disagree with the concept of a nation state, many of them. They feel like the concept is so broken, and they want to explore other models, which they call crypto states, startup states, all kinds of other insane names. They want AI and the blockchain to power these nation states and have it undergird the foundation of so many of these things. And then they want new tech and its rules and culture, et cetera, to replace existing liberal institutions, which they believe are inefficient and money pits. And this sounds crazy, but again, in our conversation, we're going to get into how some of this is coming into fruition right now. So hopefully that language feels more familiar and is giving you a little less anxiety, but a lot more rage. The playbook, I hope, leaves you super pissed off, because the playbook is very familiar and has been cobbled together for maximum impact. So you have to think about this tech capital playbook as this like love child of like Wall Street looting, Silicon Valley techno dystopia, and just good old fashioned fascism. And the goal is, again, to figure out how do you convert your market power into political power. And they have a lot of examples to pull from, right? So the hostile takeover strategies that we've seen in the world of finance are in play here. This is straight from private equity. Private equity loves using these strategies called buyouts to basically buy a company, cut everything down to the bare bones, gut it completely, and then exit with a fat profit for themselves. And Alyssa really is the expert on this and is going to talk more about it. But we've seen how this has led to the destruction of companies like Toys R Us and has put millions and millions of workers out of work. We also saw this when Elon Musk bought out Twitter and gutted it from the inside out. This is essentially what DOGE is doing right now to federal agencies. I mean, the strategies are the same. Even the HR language is the same. Like the fork in the road that is mentioned in this Bloomberg piece here is the same language that they used when they were firing federal workers. So another clear example, clear example that they can pull from is the right's long obsession and hatred of the administrative state. And by administrative state, I mean this amalgam of federal agencies and programs that power the country. They have called it bloated, unconstitutional. Bannon gave a speech at CPAC in 2017 where he laid out how he wanted to dismantle the administrative state. And it was very reminiscent of speeches that you heard Newt Gingrich and Ronald Reagan say back in the day. So this is not just like a past 10 years kind of a thing. This is many decades that they have laid down the ideological and political groundwork to dismantle it. And after Trump 1.0, his main staff actually went to Heritage Foundation to lay out this blueprint for how to do this. And that's how we got Project 2025. On startup states, I mean, as I mentioned before, these guys do not believe in the concept of a nation state. They think it's broken. So they came up with these startup states that are free trade zones where corporate power reigns supreme. If any of you have heard about Prospera, that is a perfect example of this. And Curtis Yarvin wrote about this a few years ago. And that's what this little piece is. He was basically conceptualizing El Salvador as a startup state. So this is happening right now, sadly. It's happening in where I live in California. We have like examples of this popping up in counties and cities. And this is something that they're trying to actively do with the federal government as well, treat it as a startup state. I'm sure a lot of you are watching the slate of cabinet appointees getting confirmed in the Senate, some of them with Dem support. This is a cabinet that is completely influenced by crypto, tech, Wall Street, oil and gas. It's not too dissimilar from his first cabinet. So the second cabinet got refined again from the lessons of the first. I had a really fun time putting this X on Vivek Ramaswamy's face. That brought me some joy as I was working on this. I just wanted to point it out in case others want to take some joy too. And then lastly, as I mentioned, MAGA grass tops, right? Like Manhattan Institute, Cato Institute, Heritage Foundation being the critical ones that take these like really insane ideas and turn them into policy frameworks that impact politics and are impacting politics right now. We are literally seeing so many policy briefs, memos, et cetera, produced by these institutions make their ways into executive orders, into regulations, all of that right now. And then lastly, the OG, which is Newt Gingrich and Ronald Reagan. I mean, again, they put down the softer version of everything that we are seeing now, but it is again, this has been something that has been many decades in the works. We are just seeing the worst and most insane iteration of it right now. So with that, I am going to stop speaking, and hopefully that helps set the stage for you all as we prepare to hear from our two brilliant experts, Chastity and Alyssa. These are two longtime friends and co-conspirators who are deep experts on different aspects of tech capital. So it's an honor to be here with them tonight. So I want to kick it off with you, Chastity. Hi, nice to see you.
Wow.
It's you and I have been talking for a few weeks now, Chaz, and talking about not just what's happening right now, but our friends who are federal workers at different agencies like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau or the Securities and Exchange Commission, people who are brilliant, principled humans who went into government for the sake of public service and they wanted to help everyone out. And now they're either on admin leave or they're out of work. So I wanted to talk to you and ask you to ground this moment in the impact on federal workers like them. What are you hearing and seeing from them? You're in DC. What is the energy that you're feeling? And then what is any of the power analysis that you're hearing from folks about this moment?
Course. Well, first I want to say thank you for having me, Thomas. Thanks for putting together, and obviously it's a pleasure to be amongst you all. I just want to really start by saying that right now this is not just about federal workers struggling, right? It's about a capitalistic system that thrives on exploiting labor while protecting wealth and corporate interests. And I would say federal workers, all workers, are being squeezed by the ruling class that benefits from austerity, privatization, and the erosion of public services. Right now, government employees are expected to keep the country running, and they are still being threatened with wage stagnation, budget cuts, political attacks to their unions, and let's be honest, like the ruling class needs a scapegoat. They need to point to federal workers and unions, and they need to be able to do that so that way they could say that it's inefficient, that the way that our government is working is inefficient, and that federal employees are overpaid. And they do this so that way they can justify cutting public services. And they do it while other corporations get tax breaks. The federal workforce is disproportionately Black, brown, woman-led, and when wages are stagnant and when hiring freezes stretch workloads, when unions are being attacked, this isn't just like an economic issue. It's systemic oppression reinforcing inequality. And families are skipping meals, rationing medicine, taking debt while billionaires accumulate wealth at historic rates. And so I think the question that we should be asking, especially in this moment, as I see my colleagues sort of going through this process, is like, are we actively working working against dismantling public services in favor of these private contracts? And how are we thinking about the attempts to gut our services and outsourcing federal functions to low wage contractors? This is like a class warfare, and it's disguised as efficiency. And we really the truth is, it's like the state relies on federal workers to keep society functioning. And if they continue to refuse them fair wages, job security, or allowing them to be in strong unions, um, it should be clear that it is all by design, right? It needs a weak federal workforce to justify this. And so I think, federal workers have power, but only if we wield it collectively, only if they wield it collectively, mass, demonstrations, political education goes beyond like policy reform. And we have to demand systemic change. And the corporate, I would say, stranglehold on public resources, and will worker control over federal agencies.
just want to say everything you said now makes you an honorary union organizer, Chastity. Welcome to our side. So I want to get into the point that you made about privatizing government functions. You were in government for so many years, and most recently were involved in Treasury's payment system. Talk to us more about that. Like, what are some of the most dangerous things you're witnessing right now with DOGE coming in and getting access to these things?
Sure. Maybe I can try to explain a little bit more about what it means in terms of them accessing the Treasury payment systems. Essentially, it's not that Treasury specifically controls payments to Social Security or other types of like payment mechanisms that we have, but it acts as an intermediary and it handles the final transaction. So because even though it does not have that sort of granular control over payments, there is a bigger risk, right? And that's, cutting off payments at the agency level. So what does that mean? I mean, because Treasury processes Social Security, disability benefits, tax refunds, food assistance, and other critical payments, it could mean that Musk or his political allies could gain further control over payments infrastructure, and they can exert that influence on who gets paid and who doesn't. It can mean that agencies could be pressured to withhold payments to certain people. For example, if law enforcement wanted to freeze payments to people under investigation or block benefits to those deemed undesirable, the system could make that easier. And this is a very obvious thing, right? But Treasury contains a lot of sensitive and personal data. It's the Social Security, tax records, as I said before. And what does that mean, right? Like it's mass surveillance. We're already under mass surveillance. Let's be clear. Government's been watching, still watches our transaction and it shares it with law enforcement. What happens when the private sector is able to do it without any guardrails? Right now, we see people are tracking payments data is being used to track where people are getting abortion. Payments data is being used to heat map where people are going to go have protests. They heat map the George Floyd movement and the protests there. And then that payments data has also been used. Financial transaction data has also been used to be shared with DHS to deport immigrants. What does that mean? What does that mean when we are doing that in the public sector, but now that data is being extracted to the private sector? That means they can not only do that, but now they can sort of target whatever sort of horrible products towards these consumers and communities and lead them to not getting access to certain banking products. But I think what's most scary, and I already said it at the top, is just like the people who depend on like SNAP, who depend on Social Security checks, they have no choice but to opt in to these payment systems. They have no choice but to receive money through these payment systems. And now they have no choice but to have their data exposed to someone who's not even elected. That is a very scary thing. And that is what a lot of people have been sort of paying attention to, where a lot of Treasury inside and out former colleagues have sort of been taken aback. I mean, think about Musk's history with fintech and types of technology, right? PayPal, X payments. I mean, what will he try to privatize within our government payment system? And will it be sold? Will it be leaked? Will it be misused, as I was saying before? And those are the things that I think are most scary to me. That's what I find the most dangerous that we're witnessing right now.
Yeah, and I mean, going to like Musk and his fintech and firms that and projects that he has in the pipeline, the agency that would regulate that is who? The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau?
Yeah, exactly.
And DOGE just totally gutted them with mass layoffs and the building lease getting cut and all of these things. And I think this is the stuff that is getting lost in the sauce a little bit, which you and me have talked about a bunch. People don't understand what it is that these federal agencies and civil servants do and the kind of protections that they offer. And when things like this happen with the CFPB completely getting cut, we are now creating the grounds for something like a 2008 economic crisis to repeat all over again. And I actually want to play a clip. Thomas, I don't know if you have it lined up.
I do have it lined up.
Okay.
Just give me 1 second.
Yeah. This is the director or the former director of the CFPB speaking about exactly what is happening to them right now.
Employees are being told to stay silent and stay home.
Key question, where's Congress?
Well, Congress is the one who makes the laws. You can't just say we're going to pass these laws to protect consumers and then act like the agency is a dead fish. That's not how the Constitution works.
Can't the president shut down an agency in the executive branch because, I don't know, he thinks it's redundant, thinks it costs too much money, whatever reason?
Generally speaking, agencies are established by laws, and eliminating an agency is also done through Congress. All I can say is that the uncertainty around this is a huge signal to the industry that maybe they can get away with cheating people. A lot of employees.
Thanks, Thomas. So, Chaz, I mean, you come out of this world of financial regulation, and we just heard Rohit talk about both how these unconstitutional acts by DOGE are putting so many people and their financial economic welfare at risk. Tell us what it means to lose a critical agency in its programs like the CFPB.
Let's start why the CFPB was created anyway. It was created because Wall Street and the banking industry threw this country into a historic economic crisis in 2008, which is what you've already mentioned. And it destroyed the livelihoods of millions. And while the government bailed them out with public money, we decided that it was time to have an agency that was meant to ensure that that never happened again, to regulate predatory lenders, to fight against discriminatory banking practices, and return billions of dollars to consumers cheated by financial institutions. Now, with this mass layoff and the lease on its building cut, we are seeing a direct attack on its mission. This isn't just cost cutting, this is dismantling federal oversight so that banks, payday lenders, corporate landlords can operate without consequence. And the people who will suffer most every single time, workers, single mothers, Black and brown communities, the elderly, the disabled, all of us who are already struggling to keep up with this rigged system. And because I spent years in the government working on Treasury systems and working within that sort of institution, I can tell you what happens when you weaken financial protections at this level. You know, we'll see illegal fees, we'll see wage garnishments, we'll see loan denials, we'll see outright scams designed to extract wealth from the most vulnerable. We're already seeing the rollback of fair lending rules, the gutting of anti-discrimination protections, and banks positioning themselves to push risk onto everyday people, just like they did before. When? In 2008. And so I think we also got to think about the fact that banks are allowed to exploit these people freely. They, not just this administration, but they were able to do it last administration. And wages just don't stretch as far. And eviction rates will continue to climb, and families will be forced deeper into debt traps. Meanwhile, billionaires will continue to accumulate wealth, as I've said 1,000 times before. So it's not just happening in isolation, right? The CFPB and the destruction of the CFPB is not happening in isolation. It's a part of a broader strategic assault on federal agencies and the very concept of government working for the people. This is the same playbook being used to strip resources from labor protections and social safety nets and public institutions that protect working class people and what they rely on. And so the question is, like, what do? We need to stop playing defense, right? We need to start organizing offensively. This is a moment for mass action. And workers need to mobilize. They need to fight beyond the workplace for the working class to refuse to allow its government to be handed over to corporate interests. The CFPB wasn't just created because, we needed to, it was created because someone just had this great idea. People fought for that. People fought for the CFPB to be created. And if we want protections, we want justice, we got to take power and force the government to serve us and not Wall Street.
100% agree. So many of my mentors in labor really, they fought tooth and nail for the CFPB to exist. And it was because we were seeing everything that was happening after the 2008 economic crisis. My dad lost his job 3 times. Everyone was losing their homes going underwater left and right. So totally agree with you. And the CFPB fight is not over. Happy to share resources later. It is still actively going on. But I want to switch to you, Alyssa. You've seen everything that Chastity just described about the kind of gutting of the federal government that's happening right now. You've seen this kind of gutting play out so many times in the private sector. And words like hostile takeover are from the world you're most familiar with, which is private equity. So talk to us about private equity. What is it? Why does it get such a bad rap? What happens after a hostile takeover? What is even a hostile takeover?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm already learning so much from your introductory remarks, Vasudha and Chastity there. Thank you so much for offering your perspective. It's an honor to be here. Yeah, so I've spent a little bit more than a decade researching private equity. I am speaking tonight in my personal capacity, not on behalf of any of the orgs I've had the privilege to work for. So hostile takeovers are kind of, just to go back to bread and butter, that's bread and butter for the private equity industry. It's an industry notorious for taking over companies, for aggressive cost cutting. It is super opaque. It is barely regulated. It manages about 15 trillion in assets right now globally. Chastity was talking about some of the abuses of the banks. Private equity works in the spaces that banks don't. It's a shadow banking system. It is a shadowy part of the financial markets that is extremely predatory and dangerous. They're in the business of taking over companies. They strip value out of them to extract profits. Private equity-backed companies are loaded with debt. They are far more likely to go bankrupt. They have a track record of mass layoffs, of worker abuses, not to mention whatever their product is, many times is harmful to communities. When she left the Federal Trade Commission, Biden's head of the Federal Trade Commission was Lena Khan. She gave an exit interview to the Financial Times, and one of the messages she wanted to get across as she left the administration was a warning about quote unquote catastrophic consequences if the Trump administration's antitrust officials don't scrutinize private equity's behavior. Private equity, as Vasudha pointed out at the top, has ties to the administration. They spent a lot of money in the election. Combined between a bunch of firms, they spent a little bit more than Elon did out of his own pocket, close to 300 million. They spent 20 billion last year in lobbying efforts to fend off any possible attempts at regulating and reining in their activities. One example, top line this week, of private equity's ties to the administrations are the appointee for the #2 spot at the Secretary of Defense. Vasudha, you mentioned that company earlier. It's a guy named Steven Feinberg. He's a co-founder of a private equity firm called Cerberus. They chose to name their company Cerberus. Cerberus is a three-headed dog in Greek mythology that guards the gates of hell. That's the public image that they wanted to go for, okay? So Elizabeth Warren, who was one of the folks instrumental in setting up the Consumer Protection Bureau, she grilled him today or earlier this week in his appointment hearings. And Vasudha, you pointed out some of their fine work. They take over companies, they load them with debt. They bankrupted a hospital system that has had impacts across the country, but particularly in Massachusetts, laid off, thousands of healthcare workers and have deprived communities of primary care, while lining their pockets with what was your slide, 800 million that they pocketed for bankrupting hospitals. So that's kind of their playbook. They own Albertsons, Kroger. They've been trying to merge them under the Biden administration. FTC was blocking that merger because of the harms to consumers. We'll see. We'll see how that plays out. So there, as you all have heard, there are lots of parallels in how the administration is behaving from the private equity model, from the playbook of vulture capitalism. It's like a false fealty to quote unquote efficiency. Chastity, you were talking about that. Their vision of efficiency somehow justifies enriching the overlords and the owners, but requires indiscriminate cuts to workers and jobs. What's considered waste or fat is defined completely arbitrarily by what serves the corporate owner, not what's in the best interest of the company that they took over, and even less so the community that that company operates in. It's a tails you lose, heads I win model. And so we're seeing that play out applied to government right now. The type of deregulation, as you all are saying, is gutting the agencies that might have a chance at reining in some of the worst abuses and excesses of these private corporations. I also just want to invite us to think about how the capital markets, like there's impacts on government, right? And those of us that are served by the government that is there to serve us. But then there's the capital markets, and the capital markets also stand to benefit from the current administration's approach. Now, there are questions about what will be the overall economic impact of Trump's policies, because some of them, I mean, there's clearly an interest in benefiting corporations no matter what. More tax cuts, like less regulations, all of that. But there's some counter forces as well, right? Like in blowing up relationships with our best allies, like putting, tariffs on our most important trade partners could be damaging to the economy. So it's a little bit up in the air how all of that is going to play out. The fun thing for private equity is they're going to benefit either way. They benefit from economic disruption. So like if Trump's policies hurt companies on Wall Street that are publicly traded and their stock falls, that makes them a ripe target for a private equity takeover to extract as much value out of them and maybe leave them bankrupt or spin them off and lay off workers to make sure that they can line their pockets. So it kind of remains to be seen. I would also say that sort of the leverage buyout model, as you all have pointed out, like there's the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. Well, private equity owns, for example, payday lenders. A lot of payday lenders have been bought up by private equity firms. There is litigation from state AGs, attorneys general, happening right now for abuses by payday lenders that are private equity backed. Hopefully that litigation will be ongoing. Some of it's pretty new. Private equity firms will benefit from rolling back Environmental Protection Agency powers. They own a lot of energy infrastructure. They are financing the build out of liquefied natural gas terminals in the Gulf, despite community opposition and environmental justice fights to block those. And, we all know that this administration is very pro fossil fuel. Private equity is intertwined with a lot of the fossil fuel build out. Private equity is buying aging coal plants that might have been on the chopping block. It might have been reaching, close to retirement age. Now Trump is gonna favor coal again, and then there's this excuse that there's a higher demand for energy because of AI. And so maybe we should just keep those coal plants burning with all of the detrimental health effects to usually communities of color that are upwind of these types of plants, and you have private equity firms buying them. So there are many, many examples in sort of the private sector in the capital markets where private equity is going to benefit both from favorable treatment and close relationships in this administration, from the rollback of regulations that might protect consumers and the public in some of the industries that they operate in. Private equity owns a lot of the services in the prison industrial complex. They've bought up the telecom and the commissary services. So the expansion of prisons and immigration detention can also be a profit center for private equity firms.
Whew, I forgot about the financialization of everything. And I really appreciate you grounding all of us in that reminder. I think for a while, people start to feel like they're conspiracy theorists because they're like, oh my God, my medical provider is now being taken over by private equity. My newspaper is taken over by private equity. and you just start seeing it everywhere around you. I remember when my favorite cookie brand got taken over by private equity. I was like, am I losing my mind? And it's like, no, this is just so pervasive. And this playbook of coming in, like you said, loading it with debt, gutting it, leaving with a huge profit is the model that we're seeing play out at and the federal government right now. And you have guys like Tom Kraus, who is a private equity executive, part of DOGE, now at Treasury. These are people that have firsthand experience that are leading this. And it's been interesting to see how Elon Musk has put together his DOGE team. He's brought in people from law, from private equity, from tech, all of these different places. And the New York Times has a great story this morning about the 45 people that they've identified that is part of DOGE. And it was funny to go through and be like, who's the finance bro? Who's not? And you, Alyssa, led some of this early research on Elon Musk and Tesla when you were at UAW. What are some insights that you picked up about him and how he moves from that time that are relevant to this moment and how he's showing up with DOGE?
Yeah, yeah, I did spend a few years working with the United Auto Workers in support of workers at the plant in Fremont, California, in their organizing efforts. My experience is from a couple years ago. Elon, at that time, was just like a double-digit billionaire. And he ran this like startup car company and he had this like space thing going on, and like certainly people in California knew about him. He's certainly absolutely a product of the Silicon Valley and has, yeah, that those ties to Peter Thiel, and comes, made money in PayPal. Um, I think things that were evident to us and to workers on the plant floor, uh, 7, 8 years ago, now are becoming evident to everyone else. Um, Elon has always thought that rules and regulations were for dummies. He thinks he's not a dummy. I think it's highly debatable. Um, he takes any enforcement action by an agency as like a personal affront. And it's an impediment to his ego, to his ambition, to his genius. I would describe him as petty, as vengeful, and the havoc he is wreaking right now in federal agencies, he has done repeatedly across his businesses. Mass layoffs, allegedly for performance, right? He did that at Tesla. And some of that may have been to mask firings of union organizers in the plant. At Twitter, when he took over Twitter, he laid off tons of people. He lays off like entire teams that are mission critical for the companies that he runs. He laid off quality control inspectors at an auto plant, right? So this is like his playbook. He has a bag of tricks and he just rolls them out over and over again. And unfortunately, he has been empowered to roll it out on a larger scale each time. When he took over Twitter, some of you all, remember that he took it private with an unknown number of investors that he is beholden to. He alienated a lot of investors. He shirked bills to contractors, to vendors. He fought tooth and nail any employee back pay for people that fought their layoffs. And it's private, so we don't know a lot about Tesla's finances, but at least so far, it feels like an abject failure from a financial perspective. But as a tool for political manipulation, the takeover of Twitter has been really effective for Elon. And I think it's useful to keep in mind that while he is financially extremely successful, he's willing to destroy the very source of his success in pursuit of his own ambition. But I think that's becoming pretty clear to everybody these days.
Was he also microdosing ketamine at the time you were doing your research?
I don't have documentation to prove that, but I'd be surprised if he weren't. And he's very much in the martyr, like he would describe how he would sleep on the factory floor when they were having production difficulties. And like he really has this, he's an absolute egomaniac who thinks that only Elon can save things. And I was reminded, Vasudha, at the top when you were talking about him and some of this cohort, some of whom are sort of deep in intellectual theories. I fully agree with you that like the deepest Elon gets is like 280 characters. Like that's it.
Kind of depressing to find out how stupid these guys are and how much power they have. But thank you, Alyssa. I want to switch to a different part of tech capital with you, Chastity. So you have a ton of experience in this world of crypto and venture capital. And venture capital, for folks that don't know, it's just a form of finance that is the money behind a lot of startups. So before startups become big companies like Uber, Airbnb, etc., they get their money from investors like venture capitalists. That is the simplest way I can describe it. Chaz, I'm curious to hear from you, especially based off of what Alyssa just shared about Elon Musk and the private equity guys. What were your impressions of people in the world of crypto and venture capital when you were dealing with them? I think as early as like 2019. Like, what were the demographics of that group, and what were some of the ideologies and politics you were witnessing from them?
It's a good question. When I first interacted with that industry, they were predominantly white male, unsurprisingly, but I think they wanted to sell a lot of members, and that's at the time I was working for Congresswoman Tlaib. I think they were trying to sell members or a lot of new members on the fact that crypto could potentially advance or support communities that don't typically have access to the financial system. And typically that works with members of Congress, but or across the board, especially if you're dealing with members of Congress that have a constituency that are looking for alternatives or looking for something if they have been normally excluded. But what I came to realize pretty quickly, and a lot of people did as well, is like there was no proof of concept that they were helping any community. It was just another way to sort of sell quote unquote innovation, even though it was doing the opposite, right? We saw a lot of proof of concept of it being completely exploitative. So we introduced a bill. It was probably the first bill that regulated crypto, which was stablecoins, stablecoin bill. And in my interactions with them, I did engage with that industry. A lot of the things that they wanted in terms of, I guess, inclusions in the bill just wasn't reasonable. It was just the opposite of regulation. And when the bill was introduced, because there was not a bill out there like that, they were outraged. I probably got more calls and more text and more people asking for meetings that I had from that industry that I had, and probably the entire time I had been there. And they were so angry that I got cyberbullied by that community because they were so pissed that this bill was introduced in the first place. I mean, just being called everything under the sun, which is just shows the entitlement of this community. It shows the entitlement of this group of people because they're being exposed, because we are now putting out there that there needs to be some regulation. So I would say at first they were pretty kind when they were trying to sell this as something that was useful, but then they became pretty evil when they realized that I just wasn't buying it, and I don't think anybody else probably in that group of people, the squad, AOC, Rashida, all those folks were buying it either. So I think that was probably maybe my first interactions with that group, and I don't think much has changed.
So I remember when you got cyberbullied, you had to go private on Twitter because of it, right?
Yeah, I gotta get off Twitter, actually.
Join the
Yeah.
club.
Yeah.
It's interesting to hear you say this because last year, they were some of the largest campaign finance spenders. I think collectively something north of like 300 million. And then their crypto VC PAC, which was called Fairshake, was the largest super PAC and outpaced all other corporate spending. I mean, I know you don't have any sort of insider knowledge here, but I would love to hear any thoughts or reflections from you as someone who had to deal with them when they were trying the legislative lobbying route to get things that were favorable to them. That didn't work. Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX blew up and all of that happened. And then they just decided, fuck it. We're just going to go out there and we're going to buy elections and elected officials. And now they are deep in the Trump administration in so many different parts. How is that sitting with you, and any thoughts and reflections you have as someone who's watched this industry like really grow up and sadly glow up over the past few years?
Yeah. I mean, it's frustrating, right? Because I think there is still a lot of misconceptions about whether or not these products are useful to these communities or my community or other communities that might face some sort of marginalization or exclusion from the financial system. And so it's really hard to get the same group of people that probably should collectively be moving together to fight against this to do it because they think it's helpful, they think it's useful. And I think that's one thing that's very frustrating. But you're right, they weren't just spending money on elections, they were outright trying to buy the government. And to be honest, they're succeeding. They are succeeding. Uh, I think it's a full-scale assault on democracy by a group of people who just want to exist completely outside of government, outside of law, and outside of regulation. I think a lot of regulators have become their puppets, and I don't think a lot of people have spine to regulate them. And without enough money, they can stack Congress, the White House, financial agencies with people who want to gut consumer protections. I think their whole model, the whole crypto model is built on speculation and lack of accountability and preying on working class people who get lured into what I was saying before, financial freedom. And, when they own the government, which maybe we're probably here right now, they probably own the government. They must say that maybe you could say they own the government. These agencies, SEC, CFPB, even if we talk about it in the framework of prudential regulation or under the framework of banking regulation, we won't be able to touch them. And that means more Ponzi schemes, more financial collapses, more regular people losing their life savings. And if you want to understand the danger here, I mean, it's what you said. Look at how many billionaires spent money to influence lawmakers and then tried to rewrite the rules of the financial system in their favor. It's like, it's not even about supporting a candidate or a party. It's about turning elections into auctions. Only the highest bidder gets to decide policy. And that is what this is about. And I think that right now, just like with venture capital, they are going to push for any deregulation, and they're gonna put it in the guise of innovation. And they want a lawless financial system. They want to dismantle public institutions, and that's just kind of where we are right now. And that's how I see that industry. I sit on their panels. I sit on a lot of their panels. I say it to their face, there has to be a need for you to care enough about regulation so people can trust even using your system. It's the same concept with the financial system, people, the privacy, trust, those things that erode people from getting access to these systems, it has to apply in that industry as well. Otherwise, that same distrust, the same eroding of trust will happen there as well. They should care about it for their own funds, for their own stake, but they won't. They're going to exploit, take as much as they can. And then when it all fails and falters, the people who will be left to sort of pick up the pieces is who I've said over and over in this conversation. It's us, it's people like us.
It's so funny to see this group of mostly very online men try to tell everyone in the world for 15 years that this is the alternative to the mainstream financial system that we need, because that one was too close to the government. It was, you know, it was too pro-state and all of these things. And then to come back full circle for them to be like, actually, we don't actually hate the state. We want to become the state. And that is like just such a mind-boggling flip that they have made. And here we are. So I want to actually talk a little bit more about this. Chaz, you made an interesting comment about how they are trying to take down public institutions. And I see this a lot in my research when they talk about the New Deal, because these guys like have the weirdest opinions about it. The New Deal, as many of you know, came about after the Great Depression, was made possible because of left and labor organizing in this country. And it's the largest expression of public infrastructure projects and financial and corporate reforms that we had ever seen. So for right-wing reactionaries, when they talk about New Deal programs, they see it as this ultimate evil, this embodiment of big government and entitlement and inefficiency. And so much of this sentiment was very clear in the pushback that big tech firms like Amazon and Google had to any kind of federal regulation. And also in the world of finance and crypto, they have never hidden their anti-government politics or disdain for social safety net and all these kinds of things. But what's so funny is they are all jockeying for federal government subsidies when it comes to their research and development projects. So many of them, like Andreessen Horowitz and Mark Andreessen, got their start because of funding from the National Science Foundation. But when it comes to the programs that like Social Security, Medicaid, SNAP, et cetera, that the majority of us need, it's slash and burn. So with all of that in mind, I'm so curious to hear from you, Chaz, about what is it about the New Deal and just broadly government programs and regulations that finance and tech hate so much? And relatedly, when these programs get cut, as they're being done right now, what happens to working families, especially Black and brown ones? And why is there no resonance about that amongst all of these like tech capital bros?
Yeah. I would say because finance and tech as we know it, it exists to extract wealth, right? It's not to create stability, it's not to support communities, and it's certainly not to ensure economic justice. They despise the New Deal and every government program that puts even the slightest constraint on their ability to hoard wealth and exploit labor, right? And so these industries, they thrive when markets are deregulated, when workers are desperate, and when the public sector is weak enough to be privatized. I can go further, but I will say that if we are talking about the New Deal, it's the biggest unfettered challenge to capitalism in modern American history, and it forced the wealthy to give up some control, right? And it's what proved that the government can directly improve people's lives. Without Wall Street, without Silicon Valley, calling all the shots. And to answer your other question, I mean, Social Security and Medicaid, those type of programs, it prevents people from falling into desperation, which means what? Workers have more leverage, less need to take abusive jobs, less dependence on predatory loans, less exposure to gig economies, race to the bottom wages. The success of the New Deal debunks the myth that the free market is the best way to run society. And Social Security, which we are seeing being attacked right now, it's kept elderly people out of poverty. Unemployment insurance prevents economic collapse, right? I would just say that capitalism is just not necessary for prosperity, right? It's just not. And the public sector can be strong. There's really no excuse to let banks run student loans. Like, no justification for private equity to own hospitals, I don't know why tech billionaires need to control essential services and why they work so hard to destroy public systems, so they can replace it to profit, to line their own pockets. And that allows them to exploit people versus servicing them. So, what happens when these programs get gutted? I feel like I've said it like 10 times. Who gets hit the most? Black, brown, disabled, working class, poor. And that's what they're going to continue to do, right? And that's just sort of my perspective on that.
And Chad, you've done some like pretty interesting work. I like your point about we don't need capitalism for prosperity. You've done interesting work on other kinds of public infrastructure and public finance solutions that could exist right now that are not things that tech capital has come up with, because their version of utopia is so insane. It's literally, I mean, it's a lot of things like it's like shaping a city like San Francisco into this private dream. They want walkable cities, they want transit, but they also don't want poverty in the streets, and they don't want the social safety net that would help keep people out of poverty. They just want this very bland thing that helps them feel protected and safe and rich all the time. It's a very beige vision for what a city should be. And it also takes all the public functions and privatizes it. But you have done some work on like what are alternatives that could exist, right? Can you share a couple of those things with us so people have a sense of like what that could look like?
Sure. Well, most of the like thinking around like public infrastructure has mostly been in the finance space. So, working for Talib, she would always say in her remarks, I serve the third poorest congressional district in the United States. And what that did in terms of, because she was so in tune to community, what that did was force us to think about money and getting money to her communities in ways that we had not thought about before, not through CDFIs, not through asking a bank to open a branch. Like, how do we think about this more broadly? And so that's why we thought about the public banking bill, which was sort of like federal funding being used for states to determine what type of public banks or what type of public finance infrastructure they wanted. It could be climate finance, it could be, whatever the state would decide. So that was one of the things I think ended up being super useful. And then we spent a lot of time during COVID really thinking about how to reach communities. They had these economic impact payment cards, but they were getting lost in the mail. It was a lot of just crap with it. And I think we were like, how do we actually get money into the hands of people? And a lot of that thinking was like, why don't we set up mobile, systems for people to get their cards? Or why don't we set up, cash waste for people to facilitate and use cash versus trying to get them to be completely included into the digital system? How do we put so much money in people's pockets? I would say $2,000 recurring payments. That whole conversation was because Talib was bold enough to say, why are we not giving everybody in the household $2,000 and doing it monthly? And a lot of the like legislation at the time was not that. They were like, let's give people $1,500 quarterly. Like, what is that going to do for a family? So that was like the sort of thinking that happened, and a lot of that sort of like allowed me to think more broadly, like even in terms of the work that I'm doing at Manchester, right? It's like, how do we create a way for people to be included in the digital system without necessarily having an intermediary, without having someone surveil their financial transactions, without necessarily having to get on a software device? How do we do that using hardware devices, QR codes? How do we use it doing, neo fields? And is there existing public infrastructure that exists that could allow for that to happen? Alexis Goldstein, who was at the CFPB, was giving some thought to this in terms of student payments. How do we make sure we get Pell Grants to students without an intermediary? And I think that sort of thinking is kind of what's necessary. Like, how do we use existing infrastructure, hardware devices to get people? Because the second largest reasons why people are on bank because of trust, lack of privacy. It's because AML, all of these like sort of surveillance laws that exist are making people be excluded from bank accounts because they are making determinations on, you know, people's demographics and backgrounds. And so I think a lot of the sort of public infrastructure that we should be thinking about is like actually solving for the issue versus using the private sector as a vehicle or giving them more money to think through solutions when they're always going to be thinking about yield, right? And so I think that was like some of the thinking there, like, you know, offline, anonymized payments, between two, closed loop, no intermediary, public banks, you know, making sure that people have access to certain financial means. And that was kind of what I tried to do at Treasury, but it's Treasury, so.
Thank you for that vision, Chaz. I want to get to one of the things you talked about, which is free money back to people. And it's so annoying because I know Elon Musk is talking about DOGE dividends and getting money back to people, which I'm just like, you're never going to do that. But sure, act like a populist hero if you want to. And I want to ask you a bit more about this, Alyssa. Like, what is he trying to create by everything that he's doing through DOGE? Like all the things he's taking down, all the people he's putting out of work. It's not just like ketamine fueled trolling. There's something behind it. And then what's his end goal? Like, is it just, does he want to take the Treasury payment system and like put it on something owned by him and X? Or like, what is he trying to do here?
I mean, probably I would turn it to Chastity as well. I'm sure she has ideas. But yeah, I think the privatization of public payment systems and, you know, turning what have been government services into profit centers for private industry and for the tech world seems right up their alley, right? And they do have a track record on it. And Chastity, you also talked about the transfer of wealth, right? Like we have all in our lifetimes witnessed massive transfer of wealth from communities of color into the hands of corporations and the individual billionaires that run them. Private equity and Elon Musk are two examples of that. In the private equity space, just to take one example of a transfer of wealth, there are lots of them, but you think about housing, right? And think about how, I mean, Chastity, you were talking about like how we created the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau in response to the great financial crisis in 2008, right? There was massive fallout in the housing space and millions of people lost their homes. Well, guess who owns those houses now? Private equity firms have spent the last 15 years building up an empire of real estate. They already owned a lot of commercial real estate and they decided why not take over residential real estate too? And so over that 15-year period, like the transfer of wealth from families that used to, for a brief time or a long time, own their own homes into the hands of private equity overlords has been like eye-popping. The biggest landlords in the country are private equity firms. They own hundreds of millions of units. The single family home has been a particular target. It used to be like a starter home option for families that weren't particularly wealthy. Housing has been a source of wealth building for working class families and people of color for decades. It's what we claim as one of, the builders of the middle class in this country. We've decimated it, and we have allowed private equity to do it with no pushback whatsoever. And it's like a heartbreaking transfer of wealth to billionaires who are already wealthy to begin with. Now they lease those houses out instead of leaving them on the market for someone to buy them. And they have like lease to own schemes that are like purely fraudulent. They own millions of apartment units as well. They super aggressively drive up rents. During the pandemic, there was, a moratorium, a federal moratorium on evictions. As soon as that moratorium was dropped, right, evictions spiked. They continue to, they evict tenants and then hike the rent for the new tenants coming in. There's a ton of litigation happening right now. To tie it back to tech, there's a lot of litigation happening in a number of states from attorneys general, but also the Department of Justice against a software company called RealPage, which is accused of collusion and price fixing. That's backed by private equity, where they are collecting data from lots of real estate companies about the rental rates and then suggesting what they should charge tenants. And so that has been driving up prices everywhere there's congressional interest and in fact bipartisan interest in investigating that, because housing is in a crisis state in so many districts. So that's from the private equity world. From Elon Musk, I would also point out, in addition to the access to data and the privatization of financial services and all of the profit opportunities there, Elon Musk still sits at the top of a number of these companies, of Tesla, of SpaceX, of the Boring Company, of Neuralink. Like some of the other billionaires, Jeff Bezos of Amazon, that have been under investigation by federal agencies for abuses in their industries. Elon Musk's companies have dozens and dozens of investigations and reviews that are currently, or up until now, were active against all of his companies from a punch of the federal agencies, right? The EPA, the traffic safety industry, the Consumer Protection Agency. So he has an interest in dismantling all of those investigations, just like Trump got himself elected mostly to stay out of jail and to dismantle the investigations for his misbehavior. Elon Musk is similarly motivated. And then there's the irony of their hatred of the New Deal, because Elon Musk and all of his companies are nothing if not a product of federal and state subsidy. The Washington Post published a story this week that Elon's companies have benefited from $38 billion in federal subsidies. At the times that Tesla has posted profits, a lot of that is because of credits that he trades with other automakers related to the fact that they are zero emission vehicles, right? So they're manipulating the systems that we have created for public benefit, and they are benefiting from like a state enterprise in the service of private profits. But the trade-off that we supposedly had agreed to is that there would also be enforcement by agencies for the protection of the public at large. And they want to open the tap further of federal subsidy to support their profit making, and they want to close the door on any enforcement. So they want to end the trade-off.
Just had to give out the biggest sigh, both on the RealPage part and then the Elon part. RealPage is how I pay my rent, by the way, and every time I'm like, oh. Okay, we'll talk separately about that, Alyssa. You can advise me on how to proceed without killing the vibe. Speaking of vibes, so I know we're almost at the 6:30 mark, and so grateful to you all for hanging in there with us, and just have a couple more questions. So I heard about a vibe shift in DC, and with federal workers resisting on every level, which I know Chastity has been encouraging us all to do throughout this conversation. And it's been super cool to see these like new formations of Fed workers fighting against DOGE, holding direct actions in the Senate offices, and they are coming for everyone. Democrats, Republicans, senators, agency heads, everyone. And I know we've seen some of the federal unions getting like a big membership boost. And this is really highlighting the importance of labor in this moment, right? Like that this is beyond bread and butter union service work. This is big worker organizing and solidarity that we're seeing, and it's so beautiful to see. And Alyssa, I know you and I both come from a world where we have had the joy and privilege of seeing workers take these kinds of big actions against huge corporations, huge Wall Street firms, and actually win. So for anyone on this call who is listening and they're fighting private equity takeovers of their workplaces, whether it's a company or it's a government, what are some strategies that you can share from your experience about how to protect themselves against these guys?
Yeah, I mean, just to build on some of the harms. So I mentioned earlier that private equity owned companies are much more likely to go bankrupt. So as an example of that, in 2024, 56% of the largest bankruptcies, so bankruptcies with liabilities over $500 million, 56% of those were companies that had been owned by private equity. Private equity-backed companies from those bankruptcies resulted in almost 66,000 layoffs in 2024 alone. Just recently, Joann's, the craft store, filed to liquidate. 19,000 jobs will be lost. That's another thing you can pin on private equity. So their track record is atrocious. Worker organizing has and will continue to be sort of a core source of building the communities and society that we want and we deserve. You talked about Toys R Us, Vasudha. That was an example from a little over a decade ago of a private equity liquidation, and workers fought that and organized in really creative and innovative ways, and forced the private equity overlords to pay them a $20 million hardship fund. So I would really encourage folks to think about what, like, even after they've filed bankruptcy, even after they have laid off workers, you can keep fighting. And the Toys R Us workforce is a really inspiring example of that. And, you know, I think it's part of what we're all learning, like, do not give in to the perception of inevitability. Like, we always can look for avenues to build our communities, to fight back. Organizing in workplaces is going to be key. You know, they are dismantling the National Labor Relations Board, the Department of Labor, which was put into place to regulate labor markets in a way that prevented wildcat strikes and mass work stoppages and tried to set up sort of the rules of play. It benefited companies the most, really, like more than it has benefited workers, really. So I don't want to go so far as to say that there are silver linings to dismantling the Department of Labor or the National Labor Relations Board, but it does potentially open up new avenues for folks to do creative organizing and sectoral organizing opportunities, which have been blocked under labor law for a really long time. So it's not quite, you know, hopeful, but I do think that communities have always shown tremendous creativity and resilience. And I'm looking forward to be able to continue to support those efforts. I would also say, and I know a lot of folks probably on this call tonight are thinking about this too, state legislation is another really powerful tool. And there are ongoing efforts right now. There's, even in Congress, there's bipartisan interest in trying to rein in like private equity takeovers of hospitals because the track record there is so bad. And again, like even in Republican districts, closure of a hospital is a really negative impact on the community. And so that does potentially create opportunities for stabilizing healthcare. In the states, folks are there are laws being introduced in a bunch of states around hospital mergers and giving state agencies oversight of consolidation of ownership in hospitals, but also in housing. There are interesting bills being introduced to prevent takeovers by a small number, monopolization of the residential real estate. So I do think that state legislators and AGs and maybe some folks in Congress are looking for ways to build in some protections against corporate abuses. And so I would encourage folks to be reaching out to their state legislature, to your representatives. And, if they are supporting bills related to housing protection and tenants' rights, if they are supporting bills that, seek to support workers post layoff or prevent layoffs and worker harms in bankruptcies, I would encourage you to look for ways to support your representatives that aren't looking to create those solutions.
Thanks so much, Chastity, Alyssa, for just this amazing conversation. Really appreciate us ending on a more hopeful note. And before I pass it back to CPE, I'm going to get in my Indian Ezra Klein mode and ask you both, what are 2 things you would recommend people listen to or read to learn more about this?
I think maybe there's a historical book that I really like. It's called The Wealth Divide. And there's another book I would also say that probably, I don't know if it's something that it's probably worth, I don't know, I'm like going back and forth, but it's literally about like how capitalism was created in this country. And it's called The Truth Untold. And I think it's really, it's 400 pages, but it at least provides some context for why we're here now, what's happened, what this labor has meant, what has extracting labor to create capitalism has meant. And I think it contextualized where we are today. I can't think of any modern books to think about to read. I think people should read Project 2025 since people seem to not have read that. But I think probably those three books probably could be good for people to read.
Thanks, Chaz. Alyssa?
I'm taking notes on Chastity's recommendations, but also if you don't have appetite for nonfiction right now, that's okay too. Like, it's okay to consume things that are fun. I'm enjoying season 2 of Mo on Netflix. So, like, you can treat yourself, build community, be with community. Yeah, read some of the hard stuff, but also give yourself space to remember to laugh.
You didn't want to tell them to read Barbarians at the Gate, Alyssa? No, not that 500.
These Are the Plunderers by Gretchen Morgensen. That book is great. Like, if you want to be even angrier about what private equity has done, read Gretchen Morgensen's book.
Thank you both so much for this amazing conversation. I know there's a lot of questions that have been coming in. Unfortunately, we won't have time to get to them because we were wrapped up in a really extensive conversation. And I'm going to try to answer some of them in the chat. But with that, I'm signing off and handing it back to you, Chica. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you so much, Vasudha. So I want to do 2 things to close us out. And the first and most important is to just say a huge thank you to our guests and panelists. Thank you so much, Vasudha, for holding this down and being a great anchor for this conversation. Thank you, Chastity. Thank you, Alyssa, both so much for sharing your expertise and being really generous with helping us get up to speed on everything that's been going on and how we can kind of plug in and fight back.